November 23, 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The morning frost clung to the barbed wire like strands of glass. A bitter wind rolled across the pine fields, rattling tin roofs and fluttering the stars and stripes above a camp of men who only months earlier had fought beneath the swastika. Inside the wooden mess hall, the smell of roasted turkey drifted through the air, rich, warm, unmistakably American. German prisoners shuffled forward in silence, their wool coats patched and worn. They expected the usual rations, boiled potatoes, bread, maybe thin soup. Instead, U.S. guards, smiling faintly beneath their caps, handed each man a tray heaped with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and, impossibly, a scoop of ice cream. Steam rose from the food as the Germans stared, uncertain whether this was mockery or mercy. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at the dessert, melting fast in the warmth of the hall. That Thanksgiving morning, in the heart of wartime America, men who had once faced each other through guns and fire met across a dinner table, and for a fleeting moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. It was more than a meal. It was a message. By late 1944, the United States had become the arsenal of democracy. Factories hummed day and night, turning out tanks, airplanes, and rifles at a scale unmatched in history. The war in Europe had reached a fever pitch. On the Western Front, Allied forces advanced through France after the Normandy landings, while in the East, the Soviets pressed relentlessly against German lines. Yet thousands of miles away, the American heartland remained a place of relative calm, punctuated by the distant echo of global conflict. Amid this industrial and military surge, the U.S. Army faced an unexpected logistical challenge: what to do with the tens of thousands of German soldiers captured across Europe. By 1944, over 400,000 Axis prisoners were in American hands, scattered across more than 500 camps in 46 states. These camps were not hastily improvised structures. They were carefully planned facilities, built to conform to the Geneva Convention, which dictated the humane treatment of prisoners of war. The Americans took these rules seriously, not merely as international obligation, but as a matter of national image and moral conviction. Life inside the camps was regimented but orderly. Prisoners awoke to the sharp whistle of the guards, their days punctuated by roll calls, work assignments, and inspections. Many were assigned to labor projects, clearing forests, tending farms, or contributing to wartime construction. The work was designed to be purposeful, though not punitive, aligning with the principle that prisoners must not be forced into dangerous military roles or treated as slaves. Yet, for many Germans, the transition from the battlefield to the quiet, sprawling fields of Alabama or Texas was disorienting. They arrived with suspicion, hardened by months of combat and propaganda that depicted the Americans as decadent and cruel. At the same time, the United States faced its own set of pressures. The American public expected victory abroad, but also maintained a commitment to decency and moral clarity. Newsreels, newspapers, and war correspondents emphasized the contrast between Allied values and the brutality reported from the Axis. Feeding, housing, and caring for enemy soldiers in accordance with international law was not only a moral obligation but also a demonstration of the American way of life, a subtle front in the psychological battle against Nazism. By November 1944, POW camps had become microcosms of this ideological struggle. They were isolated, fenced-in communities, yet they were meticulously supplied. Red Cross parcels arrived regularly, providing coffee, chocolate, and tobacco to supplement standard rations. Medical care was attentive, with sick bays staffed by Army doctors and nurses. And, critically, the meals themselves reflected abundance. While much of Europe endured shortages and rationing, American POWs dined on food that would have seemed lavish, even to civilians back home. Simple staples like butter and sugar, often unavailable to Germans for years, were freely incorporated into camp kitchens. The sheer scale of these operations was staggering. Camps like Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Swift in Texas, and Fort Dix in New Jersey were home to thousands of prisoners. Each camp was a small, self-contained town. Barracks lined up in orderly rows, mess halls capable of feeding hundreds at a time, and recreation areas where prisoners could play soccer or volleyball. Education programs were even established teaching English, technical skills, and civics, a subtle attempt at re-education, though the primary goal remained humane containment. For the Germans, accustomed to scarcity and authoritarian control, this combination of order, discipline, and unexpected generosity was startling. As Thanksgiving approached in 1944, these elements converged. The war continued to rage overseas, with casualties mounting and Europe still locked in conflict. Yet in the American interior, amidst the controlled routine of POW camps, a different scene began to take shape. A scene that would surprise the prisoners and leave a lasting impression. The preparations for the Thanksgiving meal were meticulous. Chefs sourced turkeys, fresh vegetables, and sweet treats. Even ice cream, a rare luxury in wartime Europe, was planned for distribution. For the Germans, the simple act of being served a complete Thanksgiving dinner without threat or coercion would challenge everything they had been taught about the Americans and about war itself. For the German prisoners, life in America was a study in contrasts. They had been soldiers trained to endure hardship, instilled with loyalty to the Reich, and hardened by years of combat on multiple fronts. Many had fought in brutal campaigns across France, Russia, and Italy, facing artillery, frostbite, and hunger. Arrival in an American POW camp brought a jarring sense of disbelief. Barracks were heated, meals were hot, and the guards, though armed, were not intent on intimidation. Orders were followed, inspections conducted, yet punishment was measured, rarely cruel. Work assignments were common, yet they were practical and legal under international law. Prisoners cleared fields, tended livestock, or labored in maintenance units. Tasks that, while physically demanding, were far removed from the life-or-death pressures of the front. Even leisure time was available. Soccer matches broke out on weekends, and small libraries offered books in German. Some prisoners learned English through structured classes. Others improvised, exchanging phrases with guards or fellow prisoners. Slowly, a picture emerged that America's promise of order, fairness, and abundance was real, not propaganda. Food, however, remained the most immediate and visceral shock. German rations on the front lines had been meager. Black bread, thin soup, sometimes ersatz coffee or margarine. In contrast, POW kitchens in the United States brimmed with butter, meat, vegetables, and sugar. Meals were regular, nutritionally balanced, and even occasionally lavish by European standards. Fresh fruit, chocolate, and canned goods supplemented the menu. For men accustomed to near starvation, each bite of creamy butter or rich stew was a quiet, almost surreal reassurance of humanity. As the leaves turned gold across the American South, word of Thanksgiving approached the camps. The German prisoners, having heard of the holiday only in passing or through rumors, were largely unaware of its cultural weight. Thanksgiving was an American institution, rooted in gratitude, family, and celebration, but its meaning within the context of war remained opaque to men who had been taught to see Americans as decadent and morally weak. Yet the camp officers and cooks prepared meticulously. Turkeys were roasted to golden perfection, cranberry sauce was made from scratch, and desserts, pumpkin pie and ice cream, were procured in quantities that seemed impossible amidst the ongoing war. For the prisoners, the sight of preparation alone was confounding. Kitchen staff moved with precision, guards carried trays with care, and even small decorations hinted at festivity. Some German men whispered to one another, speculating on the Americans' motives. Was this mockery, a propaganda stunt, or perhaps an anomaly in a world dominated by conflict and cruelty? They had arrived expecting deprivation. Instead, they saw abundance, order, and courtesy. Letters and camp newspapers from the time document this growing curiosity. Prisoners wrote to family members about the strange generosity, noting in amazement that meals were not rationed by suspicion or fear. The environment cultivated a sense of cautious trust. For many, it was the first time in years that they had felt safe from immediate threat, even as the war continued to rage thousands of miles away. Guards reported subdued conversations, smiles creeping onto otherwise stoic faces, and tentative expressions of gratitude. Small, simple human reactions became profound in a setting where survival had previously been measured only by skill, discipline, and luck. The stage was set. In the quiet of the barracks and mess halls, anticipation simmered. German prisoners wondered what awaited them that Thursday in late November 1944. For the Americans, the Thanksgiving meal was more than a holiday. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the values of democracy, decency, and compassion. It was a tangible lesson, silently imparted through turkey, pie, and a luxury few had dared to imagine: ice cream. As the first trays were carried into the hall on that crisp November morning, the contrast between expectation and reality could not have been starker. Men who had been trained to see only enemies now encountered kindness. The routine of camp life, already unlike the battlefield, was about to be punctuated by an event that would linger in memory for decades. This anticipation naturally leads to Angles, where we explore the story from human, moral, cultural, and psychological perspectives. For the German prisoners, the Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 was more than a meal. It was a mirror reflecting a world they had scarcely imagined. Many had endured months of combat, freezing trenches, and meager rations. They had been trained to fear, to fight, and to dehumanize the enemy. Now, as they stood in the mess hall, trays in hand, the shock was immediate. Some hesitated, unsure whether to eat first or even speak. Eyes widened at the roasted turkey, golden and steaming. Fingers trembled slightly as they reached for the unfamiliar dessert. A scoop of ice cream, creamy and sweet, melting slowly in the warmth of the hall. Whispers filled the air. "Is this real?" One man asked another in hesitant German. Some men laughed nervously, a sound born from disbelief. Others simply stared, letting the sensory richness of the meal, its smell, texture, and warmth, register slowly. For many, it was a reminder of life beyond the front lines, a fleeting return to normalcy that contrasted starkly with the relentless grind of war. In the quiet corners of the hall, men shared stories of families they had left behind, of holidays they had never thought they would miss until now. The U.S. Army's decision to provide a full Thanksgiving dinner, including ice cream, was deliberate. Beyond fulfilling Geneva Convention obligations, it served as a demonstration of ethical conduct in wartime. American officials understood that humane treatment of prisoners could serve as both propaganda and a moral lesson. By showing respect and generosity to captured soldiers, the Army implicitly communicated a contrast to Nazi brutality, which had become synonymous with forced labor, starvation, and executions in occupied territories. This moral positioning was not abstract. Cooks, guards, and officers participated consciously, understanding that each tray of food carried a message. The act of serving ice cream, in particular, was symbolic. A small indulgence, nearly unimaginable in wartime Germany, representing the values of abundance, care, and civility. Every scoop placed on a prisoner's tray was a silent assertion that even amidst global conflict, humanity could endure. The psychological impact of the meal on German POWs was profound. Soldiers trained to see Americans as cruel or decadent faced cognitive dissonance. Their experiences in the camp contradicted the enemy narrative they had internalized for years. This subtle shock prompted reflection, introspection, and in some cases, a reevaluation of beliefs. Prisoners began to question propaganda, wondering how a nation capable of both immense industrial power and meticulous care for captives could be as vicious as they had been told. For some men, this was the first encounter with trust in a long time. Daily routines and camp structure had already softened the harsh edges of suspicion, but the Thanksgiving dinner crystallized it. As trays were cleared and conversations grew animated, prisoners began to see the Americans not as caricatures of greed or cruelty, but as human beings with their own traditions, values, and capacity for empathy. Cultural angle. Thanksgiving itself carried significance beyond the immediate act of eating. To Americans, it was a holiday steeped in gratitude, community, and reflection. A ritual that celebrated shared abundance in the face of hardship. For the German prisoners, it was a cultural revelation. They were witnessing a society that marked its victories and fortunes not merely with weapons and conquest, but with ceremony, ritual, and generosity. Ice cream, pumpkin pie, and roasted turkey were more than sustenance. They were symbols of a civilization anchored in ritual and empathy, in contrast to their own war-torn homeland, where scarcity and fear had dominated daily life for years. The Thanksgiving dinner conveyed a sense of order, stability, and civility. The cultural lesson was unmistakable. America, even at war, could nurture humanity and maintain a moral compass. The Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 was more than an act of kindness. It was a strategic demonstration of American values. Military planners understood the significance of how prisoners were treated, both domestically and internationally. Red Cross inspections ensured compliance with the Geneva Convention, but the U.S. Army went further. By providing a full Thanksgiving meal, including ice cream, the Army showcased the humane treatment of enemy combatants. News of such events filtered back to the United States through camp newspapers and letters, reinforcing public confidence in the nation's moral stance. Newspapers occasionally highlighted these gestures, framing them as proof that America fought not only with arms but with principles. The act sent a message abroad as well. German prisoners who returned home carried first-hand accounts of generosity and fairness, undermining Nazi propaganda that depicted the Allies as decadent and cruel. In essence, the dinner was a subtle psychological front in the broader war, a demonstration that victory was coupled with ethics and restraint. The contrast between American and Axis treatment of prisoners was stark. In Germany, captured Allied soldiers often faced harsher conditions. Overcrowded camps, insufficient food, forced labor, and punitive oversight. In some cases, violations of international law were common, and Red Cross access was limited or obstructed. By comparison, the U.S. approach, regular, nutritious meals, medical attention, educational programs, and celebrations like Thanksgiving, was a radical difference. For German POWs experiencing this contrast, the psychological impact was undeniable. They saw a society that could maintain order, supply abundance, and extend courtesy to enemies, even amidst a global conflict. Many began to reconsider their understanding of the Americans, recognizing that war need not obliterate civility. Letters and memoirs later reflected astonishment at this disparity, highlighting how seemingly small acts, like serving ice cream, could challenge deep-seated beliefs and expectations. The Thanksgiving dinner also reflected the decisions of camp leadership and American officers who balanced military discipline with humanitarian concern. Commanders understood that humane treatment fostered cooperation, reduced tensions, and ensured smoother operations. Officers oversaw kitchen logistics, coordinated with Red Cross representatives, and emphasized morale as a crucial component of camp management. For example, Colonel Paul Good at Camp Aliceville reportedly instructed kitchen staff to treat every prisoner as a man, not an enemy, a principle that guided the meticulous preparations for Thanksgiving. Leadership extended beyond policy. It was visible in the gestures of guards serving meals, in the smiles offered to nervous prisoners, and in the enforcement of order without cruelty. Through these choices, the Army demonstrated that authority could be firm yet compassionate, merging military necessity with ethical responsibility. Finally, the event carried broader ideological weight. For German prisoners, the dinner served as a tangible example of American societal values: abundance, ritual, and moral clarity. Beyond the immediate human and psychological effects, it was a subtle lesson in democracy itself. Whereas Nazi Germany had cultivated obedience, fear, and scarcity, the U.S. presented structure combined with generosity, showing that power could coexist with ethics. This combination of military strategy, ethical leadership, and cultural demonstration ensured that the Thanksgiving meal resonated long after the plates were cleared. Prisoners would recall it not as a fleeting indulgence, but as a defining moment, one that reframed their perception of the enemy and, for some, planted the seeds of doubt about the propaganda that had shaped their worldview for years. November 23, 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The dawn was cold, pale sunlight cutting through a thin fog that clung to the pine-lined camp. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from the mess hall stoves and the damp earth outside. Inside the hall, the first trays had already been laid out. Golden turkeys, glistening with fat, sat alongside mounds of mashed potatoes and thick, savory stuffing. Cranberry sauce glimmered like jewels on the side plates. But it was the ice cream, soft, creamy, and almost shockingly cold, that drew the most attention. German prisoners shuffled in, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. They had been up for roll call, briefed on work assignments, and subjected to the routine discipline of camp life. Now, the unfamiliar smell of roasting turkey and baked pies met them like a revelation. Eyes darted to trays in the hands of guards, and some men froze mid-step, unsure whether to approach. The atmosphere was tense but electric, a strange mixture of anticipation, suspicion, and curiosity. A small group of prisoners whispered to one another in clipped German. "Do you think it is a trick?" asked one, his voice trembling slightly. Another shrugged. "If it is the strangest trick I have ever seen." Laughter, low and cautious, rippled through the group as they realized that no deception accompanied the feast. Guards smiled, offering words of encouragement and gestures that required no translation. Each prisoner was guided to a place at the long tables, wooden benches lined neatly for dozens of men at a time. The first bites were tentative. A scoop of mashed potatoes, a slice of turkey, the tart sweetness of cranberry sauce. Each taste registering as both familiar and alien. And then the ice cream, vanilla, churned in camp kitchens days earlier, was placed carefully on small bowls. Some men stared at it as if it might evaporate. Fingers traced the cold metal spoon, lifting the creamy mound cautiously to their lips. The reaction was immediate. Muffled gasps, laughter, even small exclamations of disbelief. The hall buzzed with quiet conversation. For the first time in months, prisoners spoke of home. Not in letters but aloud. Stories of families, hometowns, and forgotten holidays emerged in halting phrases. Some men paused between bites to look around, absorbing the absurd generosity. It was a sensation unlike any battle victory, yet it held its own power. The authority of kindness, unarmed but undeniable. Outside, the camp fences shimmered in the weak sunlight, a reminder that this generosity existed within the confines of war. Yet inside, barriers between enemy and human blurred. Officers moved among the tables, ensuring that the meal ran smoothly, yet they carried themselves with restraint and calm, allowing the prisoners space to absorb the moment. A Red Cross observer, noting the scene in a report, later wrote of astonishment, gratitude, and quiet reflection visible on every face. The psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers who had been trained to mistrust Americans began to relax. Tentative smiles spread. Nervous laughter punctuated the quiet conversations. Some men, for the first time in years, allowed themselves a sense of normalcy. The power of the moment was subtle but profound. Food, care, and shared ritual became instruments of understanding. Even the smallest details mattered. Trays were arranged with care. Spoons were polished. Ice cream did not melt into chaos but was served in measured portions, ensuring each man received his share. Every act reinforced the lesson. Abundance was not a weapon. Generosity was not a tactic. The Americans were demonstrating a principle, silently teaching that civilization could endure even in wartime. Meanwhile, camp photographers and staff documented the event. These photographs, simple yet striking, would later circulate in camp newsletters and, eventually, in letters to families. The images captured not just food, but faces. Astonishment, incredulity, gratitude, and, for some, the first cracks in long-held perceptions of the enemy. As the meal progressed, prisoners began to engage with the guards beyond simple transactional gestures. Some asked questions about the recipes, about the meaning of Thanksgiving, about life in America outside the camp. Officers answered carefully, conveying both courtesy and authority. Each interaction, each small exchange, reinforced the surreal yet powerful message. The enemy was capable of care, order, and respect. By the time the plates were cleared and the last spoons scraped empty bowls, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as suspicion had matured into cautious appreciation. For a few hours, the war receded. The clamor of battlefields, The uncertainty of Europe and the ideology of conflict were replaced by a shared, human experience. A meal, a holiday, and improbably, ice cream. This moment marked a subtle but pivotal turning point. The prisoners left the hall with more than full stomachs. They carried new perspectives, small shifts in understanding that would linger long after the war ended. What seemed like a simple Thanksgiving dinner was, in fact, a quiet, powerful lesson in humanity. The echoes of that November day did not end when the mess hall emptied. Outside, prisoners returned to barracks, carrying trays now empty but minds full of astonishment. Whispers continued in hallways and between bunks. "Did you see the ice cream?" one man asked, incredulous. "I have not eaten anything like that since I left home." Another, more reflective, muttered, "They treat us like men." Such simple statements, spoken quietly, marked the first cracks in a long-held worldview built on fear, obedience, and propaganda. Letters home became the first carriers of this revelation. Prisoners described in painstaking detail the abundance of food, the warmth of the guards, and the unusual nature of Thanksgiving itself. One letter, later preserved in a family archive, recounted, "We were given turkey, potatoes, and, can you imagine? Ice cream. I could not believe it. The Americans, they are not as they taught us. They are careful, polite, almost kind." These letters were sometimes censored or delayed by camp authorities. Yet the essence reached families, spreading a subtle narrative counter to Nazi propaganda. News of the dinner even reached local and international observers. Camp newspapers featured photographs of neatly arranged tables, trays heavy with food, and prisoners hesitating before taking their first bites. Officers emphasized discipline, yet permitted a celebratory atmosphere, aware that the event served both morale and ideological purposes. The Red Cross noted in reports that German prisoners showed astonishment mingled with gratitude, highlighting the psychological and diplomatic dimension of such humane treatment. Meanwhile, within the Nazi hierarchy, such reports were met with incredulity and, in some quarters, outrage. For propagandists accustomed to portraying Americans as decadent, weak, and self-indulgent, the idea that enemy soldiers were being served turkey and ice cream was intolerable. Official communications warned of potential propaganda contamination, fearing that POWs might return home with stories undermining the regime's portrayal of the United States. Yet the Americans remained indifferent to the outrage. Their goal was not to provoke but to demonstrate a principle. Humane conduct, even toward enemies, carried its own strategic and moral power. The reactions inside the camp evolved over the following days. Prisoners shared small tokens of gratitude. A smile, a respectful nod, or a whispered word of thanks. Some engaged more willingly in work assignments. Others participated in educational programs or language classes with greater enthusiasm. It was not obedience born of fear, but engagement born of acknowledgement. For officers observing these changes, the subtle transformation confirmed a central belief. Respect and humanity could produce cooperation and even reflection in those once considered irreconcilable enemies. Cultural and ideological shifts, though difficult to quantify, were equally profound. Many prisoners began to reconsider the American character, noticing that abundance, discipline, and generosity were not mutually exclusive. The contrast with conditions in Germany could not have been starker. Soldiers who had experienced rationing, scarcity, and authoritarian control saw a society that combined order with freedom, power with care. The Thanksgiving dinner, symbolically and practically, became a quiet testament to the possibility of moral authority alongside military might. In some cases, the impact lasted decades. Memoirs of former POWs frequently reference Thanksgiving 1944 as a defining experience. One former soldier wrote, "It was a moment when the war did not exist. We were not enemies, not combatants. We were simply men eating together." That memory stayed with me long after the guns fell silent. These reflections illustrate the enduring psychological power of small acts within a larger conflict. A single dinner, executed with care and dignity, had the capacity to reshape perceptions, humanize adversaries, and plant seeds of doubt about deeply ingrained ideologies. Even within the camp hierarchy, officers and guards recognized the broader implications. The meal was both a practical and symbolic event. It demonstrated the United States' commitment to law, ethics, and the humane treatment of prisoners, while simultaneously serving as a counter-narrative to enemy propaganda. Each scoop of ice cream, every slice of pumpkin pie, became an instrument of diplomacy and ideology, subtle yet potent. By the evening of Thanksgiving, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted permanently. Laughter and conversation replaced the tension that had previously dominated the mess hall. For a few hours, the rigid lines drawn by war blurred. Prisoners who had arrived wary and skeptical left with a sense of curiosity, astonishment, and in some cases, newfound respect. They had witnessed an unexpected form of power, the quiet, deliberate authority of kindness, hospitality, and moral integrity. In this, the Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 transcended its immediate context. It was not a battlefield victory, nor a military maneuver. Yet in the hearts and minds of those who experienced it, it became a turning point, subtle, humane, and transformative. The event laid the groundwork for the post-war reconciliation that would follow, illustrating that even in total war, small acts of humanity could leave an indelible mark. The days following Thanksgiving 1944 revealed the quiet but profound effects of the meal on both prisoners and camp operations. German soldiers returned to their routines with a subtle shift in demeanor. The rigid tension that had dominated interactions with guards had softened. Mistrust lingered, but it was tempered by curiosity and cautious appreciation. Officers noted a new willingness among prisoners to comply with schedules, participate in work assignments, and engage in camp programs. It was not blind obedience, but a measured cooperation born of respect and recognition that the Americans were not mere caricatures of cruelty. Mess halls retained a different energy. Where before prisoners had eaten in silence, tentative and wary, now small conversations and tentative laughter emerged. Men compared portions, discussed unfamiliar recipes, and asked about ingredients they had never seen in Germany. Ice cream, pumpkin pie, and cranberry sauce were no longer anomalies but reminders of abundance. A tangible representation of civility and structure in a world otherwise dominated by deprivation. For many, the memory of that Thanksgiving meal became a reference point, a standard by which all subsequent experiences in the camp were measured. Camp officers, aware of the transformative potential, leveraged these shifts to maintain order and morale. Work programs ran more smoothly. Prisoners showed greater engagement in maintenance, farming, and educational activities. Even small gestures, such as allowing men to serve themselves certain portions or participate in kitchen duties under supervision, reinforced a sense of agency and mutual respect. By treating the prisoners as human beings rather than mere captives, officers achieved results that discipline alone could never have produced. Red Cross reports from the period underscore the psychological and operational benefits of humane treatment. Observers noted that prisoners exhibited fewer disciplinary issues, greater attentiveness, and increased willingness to participate in voluntary programs. These reports were circulated among camp leadership as evidence that adherence to Geneva Convention standards, and the occasional gesture of goodwill, was not merely ethical but practical. The Thanksgiving dinner exemplified this principle. It demonstrated that small, carefully executed acts of humanity could produce measurable improvements in camp functioning and prisoner behavior. Letters sent by prisoners to families in Germany further amplified the immediate aftermath. Reports of a lavish American Thanksgiving spread quickly, creating a ripple effect within the camp and, indirectly, across the Atlantic. Families reading these letters expressed astonishment, as the reality described diverged sharply from the wartime narrative propagated by Nazi authorities. For the prisoners, sharing these experiences reinforced their sense of wonder and subtly reshaped perceptions of the enemy. It was a reminder that the world outside Europe's battlefields operated under different rules, where discipline and decency could coexist. At the same time, the event prompted subtle adjustments in camp management. Officers recognized the morale value of cultural observances and began to implement similar events on other holidays. Small celebrations, athletic competitions, and educational programs were designed to create structured, humane environments that promoted psychological stability. Thanksgiving 1944 became a blueprint for how human dignity, ritual, and abundance could coexist with the practical necessities of a POW camp. The effects extended beyond the immediate participants. Guards, cooks, and officers reported a greater sense of purpose in their duties, observing the tangible impact of their efforts on prisoner well-being. It reinforced the idea that war was not solely measured by victories on distant battlefields, but also by the capacity to maintain ethical standards and influence hearts and minds through humane action. By the end of November, Camp Aliceville and similar facilities had entered a new rhythm. Prisoners were still captives, and the war continued to rage across Europe, yet within the confines of the camp, a different reality took hold. Discipline coexisted with dignity, routine with respect, and authority with empathy. The Thanksgiving dinner, simple in execution yet profound in consequence, had created a space where humanity triumphed over suspicion, however temporarily. This atmosphere set the stage for the longer-term consequences of the event, including shifts in prisoner ideology, post-war reconciliation, and the enduring memory of American generosity. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Thanksgiving 1944 extended far beyond the immediate mess hall. German prisoners carried with them a subtle but lasting impression of the Americans' values. Many later recounted that the memory of the lavish meal, turkey, pie, and ice cream, remained vivid, a benchmark against which the rest of their wartime experience was measured. For some, it sparked an early recognition that enemy soldiers were capable of decency, challenging long-held beliefs instilled by years of Nazi propaganda. Memoirs and post-war interviews reveal that this experience often stayed with POWs long after their return to Germany. One former prisoner described how, decades later, he recalled the texture of mashed potatoes, the sweetness of cranberry sauce, and the chill of the ice cream, not as indulgence, but as proof that generosity and civility could exist even in wartime. Such memories played a quiet role in shaping post-war attitudes toward the United States, particularly in areas of West Germany where former POWs resettled. The dinner became a small but potent seed for reconciliation, illustrating that moral behavior could transcend national and ideological boundaries. Within the camps, officers and administrators recognized the longer-term benefits of humane treatment. Programs that had begun as temporary experiments, holiday celebrations, recreational sports, and educational opportunities were reinforced and expanded. Camps like Aliceville and Swift continued to provide structured environments that combined discipline with dignity. Prisoners' willingness to cooperate improved not only daily operations but also facilitated more complex initiatives, such as vocational training, agricultural work, and literacy programs. In essence, the Thanksgiving dinner had demonstrated that kindness could serve practical purposes as well as ethical ones. The event also left a mark on international perceptions. Red Cross reports cited the meal as an example of the United States' commitment to the Geneva Convention and humane treatment of prisoners. In Europe, families reading letters sent by POWs gained insight into a reality that contrasted sharply with Nazi accounts of American decadence and cruelty. These stories, seemingly small at the time, accumulated into a broader narrative that challenged the totalitarian ideology prisoners had once been required to uphold. Ice cream and turkey, in a sense, became instruments of cultural diplomacy, proof that humane treatment could influence both morale and ideology. Psychologically, the dinner altered the prisoners' view of authority and power. In Germany, soldiers had been conditioned to equate strict control with legitimacy. In America, they experienced a model where authority combined discipline with empathy. The respect shown by guards, the careful preparation of meals, and the attention to detail conveyed a lesson in moral leadership. Many prisoners internalized these lessons, later describing how the experience subtly reshaped their expectations of governance, civility, and interpersonal conduct. Even for the Americans, the event reinforced the value of ethical treatment in wartime. Officers and guards noted the tangible impact of their actions on prisoner behavior and morale. It validated the investment in humane operations, illustrating that kindness could coexist with military necessity and operational efficiency. The act of serving ice cream alongside turkey was not merely ceremonial. It was strategic, moral, and profoundly human. By the end of the war, The Thanksgiving dinners served to prisoners had become emblematic of a broader philosophy, that humanity need not be surrendered, even in total conflict. For German POWs, the memories persisted, shaping attitudes toward the United States, the Allies, and, in some cases, toward democracy itself. When these men returned home, they brought with them stories that would quietly influence post-war reconstruction, reconciliation, and the rebuilding of trust between nations. The Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 was, in essence, a turning point that extended beyond the camp fences. It demonstrated that the smallest gestures, meticulously prepared meals, acts of courtesy, and the simple delight of ice cream could resonate across time, geography, and ideology. From frost-covered pine fields in Alabama to the streets of post-war Germany, its legacy endured, quietly affirming the enduring power of civility amidst the machinery of war. In the frost of a November morning, within the fences of a camp far from battlefields, something extraordinary unfolded. A simple act, a carefully prepared Thanksgiving dinner with turkey, pie, and ice cream, transcended the ordinary constraints of war. It reminded prisoners and guards alike that even amid global conflict, the human capacity for empathy, ritual, and generosity could endure. The German soldiers, hardened by months of combat and shaped by propaganda, were confronted with a truth that words alone could not convey. The Americans who served them food did not act out of fear, obligation, or mockery. They acted with purpose, guided by a principle that even enemies could be treated with dignity. In that fleeting moment, the rigid divisions imposed by war softened, replaced by shared humanity, curiosity, and wonder. This dinner was more than a meal. It was a lesson in moral courage. It demonstrated that strength was not measured solely in weapons or strategy, but in the ability to uphold values when it would be easier to abandon them. It offered prisoners a glimpse of a society that could combine power with conscience, abundance with care, and authority with respect. For some, it challenged the very ideologies that had governed their lives, planting seeds of reflection that would last long after the war's end. History often recounts battles, strategies, and political maneuvers, yet the quiet power of a simple gesture, like serving ice cream on a cold November day, reminds us that war is experienced not only on battlefields but in moments of human connection. The Thanksgiving of 1944 endures in memory, not for its scale, but for its significance. It illuminated the strength of compassion, the subtle influence of ethics, and the enduring truth that even in total war, humanity can prevail. In that hall, trays cleared and spoons scraped, the Germans discovered something far more lasting than food. They discovered the quiet, unyielding power of mercy, and the lesson that civility, even in the darkest times, can change hearts, shape futures, and resonate across generations.